The fence was just an excuse. I thought he came with tools only to fix broken wood, but the way his eyes lingered told me he was fixing something else, something inside me I didn't even know was cracked. One moment his hands were steady on the hammer, and the next, they were steady on my hips, and suddenly the air between us felt dangerous, fragile, and impossible to ignore. I never imagined that an ordinary day, one filled with the same silence that always hung around my house, could suddenly shift into something I'd carry in my heart forever. The fence had been broken for weeks, a few boards cracked and leaning, but I kept putting off fixing it. Maybe I didn't care enough, maybe part of me liked the way it looked worn and forgotten, because it felt like me. Still, that morning, I heard a knock, not at the door but against the fence itself, a sharp sound that startled me out of my thoughts. When I stepped outside, there he was. He stood tall in the sunlight, sleeves rolled, a box of tools by his feet. His voice was calm when he explained he was here to fix what was broken, and though he meant the fence, his words felt like they touched something deeper. I tried to play it cool, offering a nod, pretending it didn't matter, but something about him unsettled me in the gentlest way. His eyes met mine, not in a casual passing glance but with a quiet intensity, like he was looking past the surface, searching. I couldn't hold that gaze for long. I turned away, crossing my arms, trying to mask the sudden rush of warmth flooding my chest. He walked over to the loose boards, kneeling, measuring them with his hands, and I found myself staring. There was nothing dramatic about the way he moved, yet it pulled me in. Every small motion felt deliberate, as if he carried with him a patience the world had forgotten. I told myself it was just curiosity, just boredom making me notice too much, but the truth pressed harder. There was something in the air, subtle but undeniable, that made the ordinary feel different. He asked me about the damage, how long it had been there, if anyone else had tried to fix it, and his voice lingered in my ears long after he stopped speaking. I answered with short words, trying not to reveal how aware I was of him. But the quiet between our sentences seemed charged, like even silence had its own heartbeat. As he worked, I noticed details I had no reason to notice. The way sunlight caught in his hair, the way the lines of his shoulders shifted under the fabric of his shirt, the soft crease of concentration at the edge of his brow. I hated myself a little for paying attention, for caring, but at the same time, I couldn't pull away. Every sound of the hammer hitting nails blended with the thrum of my pulse, louder than it should have been. And when he looked up at me, just briefly, his lips curved into a small, almost shy smile. It felt like he knew I had been staring. I swallowed, pretending to check my phone, pretending I didn't care, though my face betrayed me. Something inside me, something long buried, stirred awake. I had grown used to loneliness, to keeping everything locked inside, to never letting anyone see past the surface. But standing there, watching him, I felt exposed. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden lightning in the sky, but a quiet cracking open, like the first shift in ice before it breaks apart. My chest tightened with questions I wasn't ready to ask, with desires I wasn't ready to admit. Yet all I did was watch him work, watch him turn something broken into something whole again, as if showing me what was possible without saying a single word. I didn't know why my heart was racing, or why my hands fidgeted at my sides. I told myself it was nothing, that he was just a stranger doing a job, but deep down, I already knew it wasn't just the fence that was changing. Something else had started, something I couldn't yet name, but it had begun the moment he lifted his head and our eyes met for the first time. And though I tried to ignore it, though I told myself it was just another day, part of me already understood that this was the beginning of something I could never forget. The sound of nails sliding into it echoed softly as he worked, and I found myself drifting closer without realizing it, pulled not by the broken fence but by the strange gravity of his presence. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and sawdust, and beneath it, something warmer that clung to him, something I couldn't quite name but wanted to. He glanced up at me again, his eyes catching mine with that same steady calm, and for a moment it felt like he wasn't fixing anything at all, just studying me, as if my silence was another puzzle to be solved. I shifted awkwardly, clearing my throat, and asked a question I didn't even care about, something trivial about how long repairs like this usually took. He smiled, slow and easy, like he had all the time in the world, and answered with a patience that made me want to keep asking him anything, everything, just to hear his voice again. We slipped into conversation the way strangers sometimes do when they both sense there's more to be said than the surface allows. I told him how long the fence had been broken, how I kept putting it off, and he teased gently that maybe I liked it that way, that maybe I needed something unfinished to match my mood. His words were light, but they struck deeper than he knew, and I felt a faint burn in my cheeks that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. I tried to laugh it off, though the sound came out thinner than I meant. He didn't push. He just smiled again, as if he understood without needing me to explain. The work went on, and so did the small talk, weaving between boards and nails and quiet pauses. He asked about the neighborhood, about the weather, about what I did with my time, and with every answer, I felt myself loosening, letting out pieces of myself I usually kept locked away. It was strange how easy it was, standing there with a man I had met less than an hour ago, to feel like I wasn't invisible. He laughed at something I said, not a polite laugh but one that reached his eyes, and the sound of it filled the space between us in a way that made the world feel lighter. I watched the curve of his mouth when he smiled, the small crinkle near his eyes, the way his lips moved when he spoke. My gaze lingered longer than it should have, and when I realized it, I looked away quickly, pretending to notice the way the sun dipped lower, painting the fence in gold. But even with my eyes averted, I could feel his presence like heat on my skin, steady and unshakable. My heart was restless, beating too fast for no good reason, and my palms felt damp though I hadn't done anything but stand there. At one point, he handed me a piece of wood to hold while he hammered it into place. Our fingers brushed, just a fleeting contact, but it sent a current racing through me, sharp and unexpected. I froze, clutching the board tighter than necessary, hoping he didn't notice how stiff I'd gone. He did, though. His eyes flicked to mine, just for a second, and in that second something silent passed between us, something I didn't have words for. Neither of us spoke about it. He went back to his hammer, and I stood there pretending the touch meant nothing, though inside, it had left me reeling. As the minutes stretched, I realized how much I didn't want him to finish. Each nail driven into the fence brought him closer to being done, closer to leaving, and the thought of the yard falling silent again filled me with a kind of loneliness I wasn't ready to face. I found myself stalling, asking unnecessary questions, offering water, pointing out boards that didn't really need fixing. Anything to keep him there a little longer. And he stayed, not rushing, not seeming to mind, as if he, too, felt the unspoken pull that was tying us together piece by fragile piece. By the time the sun slid lower and shadows stretched long across the ground, I felt like the broken fence wasn't the only thing being rebuilt. Something in me had shifted, subtle but real, as if his presence had cracked open a window I had long ago sealed shut. I didn't say it aloud. I couldn't. But as I watched him wipe his hands against his jeans, smile faintly, and glance back at me with that same searching look, I knew this was more than just repairs. This was the beginning of a conversation neither of us was quite ready to end. The work slowed as the day went on, not because there was much left to fix but because every pause between us stretched longer, heavier, filled with words unsaid. He leaned against the fence for a moment, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm, and I caught myself watching him again, my eyes tracing the way his chest rose and fell, the strength in his hands as he set the hammer aside. I should have looked away, should have busied myself with something else, but I didn't. Instead, I found myself locked in that quiet moment, as if time had slowed just to let me notice the things I'd been trying to ignore. When his gaze lifted and found mine, I panicked and laughed too quickly, pointing out how crooked one of the boards looked. He tilted his head, smiling, and came closer, crouching beside it, his shoulder brushing lightly against my leg as he worked. The touch was nothing, innocent, accidental. But to me, it felt like the ground shifted beneath my feet. We kept talking, though the words had started to lose their meaning. He joked about my fence being cursed, said maybe it wanted to fall apart no matter how much effort he put in, and I laughed harder than I should have, the sound spilling out of me like I'd been holding it back for years. It wasn't about the joke, it was about him. The way he made the air lighter, the way his presence turned something as dull as broken wood into something worth remembering. I wanted to tell him, but the words lodged in my throat, heavy with fear. So instead I just stood closer, too close, pretending I needed to hold another board in place. At one point, he set his hand against the wood at the exact spot where mine rested. His fingers brushed over mine with the lightest pressure, almost like testing the water before diving in. My breath caught, sharp and loud in my own ears, and I froze. The contact was so small, so brief, yet it burned through me, sparking in my chest and racing through my veins. I pulled my hand back a little too fast, but he didn't pull his away. He kept his there, steady, as if to let me know he wasn't afraid of the moment. Our eyes met again, and this time I couldn't look away. His gaze was warm, patient, searching, and I felt exposed in a way I'd never been before. I muttered something useless, a clumsy attempt to cover up the electricity in the air, but my voice cracked, betraying me. He smiled softly, not mocking, not pressing, just waiting. That smile shook me more than the touch had, because it told me he saw straight through me and wasn't turning away. My heart hammered so hard I thought he could hear it, and I shifted, pretending to check the nails, pretending I was fine. But the truth was written all over me, and the silence between us spoke louder than anything I could have said. The longer we stood there, the more impossible it became to deny what was happening. Every time his arm brushed mine as he reached for a tool, every time his laugh rolled out low and easy, every time his gaze lingered a second too long, it all wove together into something that scared me and thrilled me at the same time. I kept telling myself to step back, to retreat, to shut down the feelings rising inside me, but instead I found myself leaning closer, drawn in as if my body had made its decision before my mind could catch up. He asked if I had ever tried fixing things myself, his tone teasing but not unkind. I shook my head, admitting I didn't know where to start, and he chuckled, saying some things aren't meant to be fixed alone. His words hung heavy, and for a moment, neither of us moved. They weren't about the fence anymore, and we both knew it. The quiet pressed down on us, thick and charged, and I wanted to say something, anything, but all I managed was a shaky laugh. He leaned back slightly, his hand brushing against mine again as he stood, and this time, I didn't move away. The sky had started to soften with the first colors of evening, streaks of orange slipping into the horizon, but I barely noticed. All I felt was the weight of his presence beside me, the warmth radiating from him, the steady rhythm of his movements that somehow matched the unsteady rhythm of my heart. The fence was almost finished, but neither of us seemed in a hurry to end what had started. I knew then that this wasn't just about repairs or chance encounters. Something bigger was unfolding, quiet and dangerous, right there between two strangers who weren't really strangers anymore. The last of the nails were driven in, and the fence stood straighter than it had in years, but my eyes weren't on the wood or the tools scattered across the ground. They were on him. He was standing so close now, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body even though we weren't touching. My chest tightened as he leaned forward, his arm brushing lightly against mine while he inspected the line of boards we had worked on together. That single brush was enough to send a shiver rushing through me, and before I could gather myself, his hand dropped from the wood and landed gently on my hip. It wasn't forceful, not even deliberate in the way it might have been if he'd planned it. It was slow, steady, like he was giving me every chance to step back. I didn't. I couldn't. My body froze, my breath caught, but I didn't move away. The world around me blurred, the sound of cars in the distance, the soft rustle of leaves, everything faded until it was only us standing there. His fingers pressed ever so slightly into my side, not enough to claim me, not enough to control me, but enough to let me know he was there, that he was aware of me in the same way I was aware of him. My heart raced wildly, and every thought in my mind tangled together in a desperate knot. Was this real? Was I imagining it? Did he feel the same pull that had been tearing at me all afternoon, or was I just lost in my own longing? But then he looked at me, and his eyes answered the question without a single word. His gaze was steady, searching, and unafraid. He didn't smile this time, didn't laugh it off the way he had before. There was something heavier in his expression, something raw, as though he had been holding back as much as I had. My lips parted, not to speak but because I didn't know what else to do, and the air between us grew hotter, thicker, impossible to ignore. He leaned in just a fraction, his breath brushing against my cheek, and I felt my knees weaken, my whole body trembling with the weight of the moment. For so long I had lived behind walls, keeping everything buried, and here he was, hands steady on my hips, eyes breaking through everything I thought I had locked away. I wanted to say something, anything, to fill the silence, but words abandoned me. My throat was dry, my voice gone, so all I could do was stand there, feeling every beat of my heart echo against the cage of my ribs. My fear and my desire collided, warring with each other, but his presence soothed the fear just enough to keep me from pulling away. There was no rush in him, no demand, only quiet patience, as though he understood exactly what this moment meant and wasn't going to ruin it with haste. His thumbs moved ever so slightly, brushing over the fabric of my shirt, and that small motion was enough to unravel me completely. I closed my eyes for a second, just long enough to gather a sliver of courage, and when I opened them again, he was still watching me, still holding me in that fragile space between what was safe and what was dangerous. My chest rose and fell in uneven breaths, and I realized that every part of me wanted this, had wanted it since the first time our eyes had met over the broken fence. The fear was still there, yes, but it was softer now, pushed aside by the warmth of his touch, by the quiet certainty in his gaze. It wasn't a kiss. It wasn't anything as dramatic as I might have imagined in secret daydreams. It was simply his hands on my hips, holding me steady, grounding me, letting me know I wasn't alone anymore. And somehow, that was more powerful than anything else could have been. In that touch, there was understanding. In that touch, there was permission. And in that touch, there was the first fragile spark of something I didn't dare name yet, but which was already burning its way into my soul. Time stretched endlessly in that moment. I forgot about the fence, about the tools, about the world beyond the yard. All that existed was the space between us, closing inch by inch, not with reckless urgency but with the slow, deliberate rhythm of two people finding the courage to stop hiding. And as I stood there with his hands warm and sure against me, I felt the walls I had built around my heart begin to crack, not with force but with tenderness, as if they had been waiting all along for someone exactly like him to bring them down. I could still feel the weight of his hands on my hips even after he let go, as though his touch had left an imprint deeper than skin. I stood there in the quiet yard, unsure of whether to move, unsure of whether to speak, my whole body caught between the fear of what I had just allowed myself to feel and the desperate need to hold on to it. The sun was dipping lower now, casting the fence and the yard in a soft orange glow, and for a long moment neither of us said a word. His eyes never left mine, steady and patient, waiting for me to decide if I was going to step back into the safety of silence or lean forward into something dangerous, something alive. My breath came uneven, every inhale jagged, every exhale shaky, and I felt like a boy again, standing on the edge of something unknown. Inside my chest a war raged, old voices rising to tell me this wasn't right, that I should stop it now before it went any further, before I got hurt. Those voices carried the weight of years, of fear, of shame, of loneliness disguised as safety. They reminded me of every time I'd looked away instead of speaking up, of every chance I'd let slip by because it was easier to keep my heart locked tight. But against those voices was another sound, softer yet stronger, a pulse that had been silent for too long but was now beating with stubborn insistence. It told me to stay, to let this happen, to stop burying what I felt before it buried me. He shifted slightly, not away from me but closer, the movement small but enough to break the paralysis that had wrapped itself around my body. His shoulder brushed mine, and though the contact was light, it carried with it a kind of reassurance, a quiet message that he wasn't going to push me, that I could take all the time I needed. That patience undid me more than any boldness could have. My throat tightened, and before I could stop myself, words slipped out, raw and uncertain. I told him I didn't know what I was doing, that I wasn't sure if I could handle what was happening. My voice shook, breaking on the edges of fear, but I forced the words into the air because I couldn't bear the silence anymore. He didn't laugh. He didn't step back. Instead, his eyes softened in a way that made my chest ache, and he said quietly that I didn't have to know, that sometimes you just feel and let the rest figure itself out. His voice was low, steady, almost grounding, and hearing it made me want to believe him, even as my mind screamed at me to retreat. His hand lifted, hesitated, then rested gently against my arm, not possessive, not demanding, just there. That small gesture cracked something in me, and suddenly I wanted to cry, though I didn't know why. Maybe it was the relief of not being alone in the moment, of not having to carry everything by myself anymore. I thought about all the times I had hidden, all the moments I'd swallowed my truth because it felt safer to keep it quiet, all the nights I'd told myself that love wasn't meant for me, not in the way I secretly longed for. And now here he was, standing in my yard with sawdust still clinging to his shirt, looking at me like I mattered, like I wasn't invisible. The realization was almost too much to bear. I looked away, blinking hard, but his hand on my arm kept me steady, kept me from drifting too far into the spiral of my own doubts. The silence stretched again, but this time it didn't feel empty. It felt full, heavy with the unspoken things we were both carrying, waiting for the courage to bring them into the light. I opened my mouth to speak, then closed it, unable to form the words. But he didn't need them. Somehow, he understood. His thumb moved slightly against my sleeve, the smallest motion, but it steadied me, pulled me back into the present, into the warmth of the evening air, into the undeniable truth of what was happening between us. For the first time in a long time, I let myself imagine what it would be like not to run, not to retreat. I pictured letting go of the fear that had kept me caged for years, pictured leaning into the possibility of something real, something raw, something terrifying but beautiful. That vision filled me with equal parts dread and longing, but it was enough to keep me standing there, enough to keep me from breaking the moment apart with excuses. I didn't know what tomorrow would look like, or even the next hour, but as his hand stayed steady on my arm and his gaze held mine without flinching, I knew I couldn't turn away. Not anymore. The yard had fallen into a deep hush, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty but alive, carrying with it every unspoken word and every unfinished thought. The fence stood fixed, straight and clean, but I no longer cared about it. All my attention was on him, on the way his presence seemed to fill every corner of the space around me. His hand still rested lightly on my arm, steady but unassuming, and that single touch was enough to tether me to the moment when everything inside me wanted to run. My chest was tight, each breath uneven, and the air between us felt charged, like the sky before a storm. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to move forward without exposing everything I had spent years burying, but the longer I stood there with him, the more impossible it became to pretend I could keep it hidden. He leaned a little closer, not enough to startle me, but enough that I felt the heat radiating from his body. His voice was low when he spoke, almost a whisper, as if he knew the words weren't meant for anyone else but me. He told me he'd seen the way I looked at him, the way my eyes lingered when I thought he wouldn't notice. My heart lurched at his honesty, my stomach twisting in equal parts fear and relief. I wanted to deny it, to laugh it off, but the truth was etched into me too deeply to disguise. My lips parted, but no words came out. All I could do was stand there, exposed and trembling, while he watched me with the kind of patience that didn't demand an answer but quietly insisted on one. When I finally found my voice, it cracked under the weight of what I was trying to admit. I told him I wasn't good at this, that I didn't know how to let someone see me like this, that I was afraid of what it might mean. My confession spilled out in fragments, shaky and unfinished, but he listened to every word as if it mattered, as if I mattered. His hand shifted from my arm to my shoulder, the warmth of his palm sinking into me like an anchor, and he said softly that fear doesn't mean we have to stop, it only means what we're feeling is real. Those words lodged themselves deep inside me, pushing against every wall I had built, and for the first time I felt like maybe I didn't have to fight them anymore. The closeness between us grew heavier, more intimate, and I could feel my body leaning forward almost against my will, as though drawn by something far greater than either of us could control. Our faces were only inches apart now, the space between us buzzing with tension, and my mind was a blur of contradictions. Every instinct I had trained into myself screamed at me to step back, to retreat into safety, but the fire in my chest burned brighter than my fear. My breath brushed against his cheek, and in that fragile closeness, I felt a strange kind of peace, as though all the noise in my head had finally quieted, leaving only this, him, me, and the electric pole binding us together. I closed my eyes because I couldn't bear the weight of his gaze any longer, and in the darkness behind my eyelids I let myself surrender, if only for a second. His hand moved again, sliding gently down my arm until his fingers brushed mine, and without thinking I let my hand fall into his. The touch was simple, innocent in any other context, but here it was everything. His fingers curled around mine, firm and certain, and I felt something inside me break open. All the loneliness, all the years of silence, all the fear I had carried suddenly felt lighter, as if holding his hand was enough to lift some of the weight I thought I'd never be free of. Neither of us spoke after that. Words seemed unnecessary, even intrusive. The silence was no longer suffocating but full, filled with the rhythm of our breaths and the quiet thrum of something we had both been too afraid to name. I held his hand tightly, afraid that if I let go, the moment would vanish, and I would wake to find it had been nothing but a dream. But he squeezed back, a gentle pressure that told me it was real, that he wasn't going anywhere. For the first time in a long time I believed as the evening shadows deepened and the first stars began to prick the sky, I realized that something irreversible had happened. It wasn't a kiss, not yet, and it wasn't a confession spoken aloud, but it was a beginning, one carved out of hesitation and fear and the fragile bravery we had found in each other's eyes. My heart was still unsteady, my doubts still loud, but beneath it all was a quiet certainty that this, whatever it was worth the risk. And as I stood there, hand in hand with him, I let myself hope that maybe, just maybe, the pieces of me I thought would stay broken forever were finally being put back together. The days after that evening felt strange, like walking through a world that had shifted slightly on its axis. The fence stood tall and unbroken, a clean line dividing the yard from everything beyond it, but I found myself staring at it differently, not as a barrier but as a reminder of the moment that had changed something inside me. I could still feel the rough texture of the wood under my palm, still remember the weight of his hand on mine, the warmth of his fingers curled around me, the steady way he held on as if to say without words that I didn't have to let go. That touch haunted me in the quiet hours, when I sat alone at the kitchen table or lay awake at night listening to the hum of the world outside. I would trace the memory over and over, not sure if it had been real or if I had only imagined it, but every time I closed my eyes, his face returned to me, clear and unshakable. I tried to distract myself, throwing my attention into little tasks, washing dishes that were already clean, sweeping the floor twice in the same day, rearranging books on shelves that hadn't been touched in months. But no matter what I did, he was there in the back of my mind, his voice, his smile, the way his eyes had looked at me like he could see past all the armor I had spent years building. It wasn't just attraction, though that pulsed through me with a sharpness I couldn't ignore, it was something heavier, something deeper, the terrifying possibility that I had finally been seen, and maybe even accepted. That realization both thrilled me and left me trembling with uncertainty. One afternoon, I caught myself walking along the fence line again, running my fingers over the boards he had repaired. I should have felt satisfaction at the work, but instead I felt an ache, a restless pull that made me wish he were standing there again, hammer in hand, sweat on his brow, teasing me with that quiet humor that made me laugh too much. My heart tightened at the thought that maybe I would never see him again, that maybe what had happened that night was only meant to be a passing spark, a fleeting warmth I wasn't supposed to hold on to. The possibility made my chest hurt, and for a moment I hated myself for letting it mean so much. But even as doubt gnawed at me, hope refused to let go. I found myself looking out the window more often than usual, listening for footsteps on the gravel or the faint creak of the gate. And then one evening, as the light faded into that soft hour between day and night, I heard it, the familiar sound of someone at the fence. My heart lurched before my body even moved, racing ahead of me as I hurried outside, trying to mask my eagerness with casual steps. And there he was. He wasn't carrying tools this time. He wasn't here for the fence. He was just there, hands in his pockets, watching me with that same steady gaze that had unraveled me days before. I froze, unsure of what to do, unsure of what to say. But he broke the silence with a small, almost shy smile, the kind that made my chest ache with something warm and dangerous. He asked if the fence was holding up, his voice teasing, and I laughed, the sound shaky but real. We both knew he hadn't come back to check on the fence. The air between us thickened again, heavy with all the things we hadn't said, and I felt my body tremble with the same mix of fear and longing that had consumed me before. Only this time, it felt different. It felt inevitable. We walked along the fence together, slowly, neither of us in a rush to reach the end. Our shoulders brushed occasionally, and each touch sparked something electric that spread through me in waves. I found myself talking more than I expected, telling him things about myself that I hadn't shared with anyone in years, little truths, small confessions, pieces of me I thought were too unimportant or too fragile to ever reveal. He listened without judgment, without interruption, and when he spoke, it was with the kind of honesty that made me feel safe. Even when the words scared me, there was no grand declaration, no sudden confession that tied everything neatly together. Instead, there was presence. There was the sound of his laughter mixing with mine, the quiet comfort of his body beside me, the promise in the way his eyes lingered when I turned to look at him. And in that slow unfolding, I realized that this was how something real began, not with fireworks or dramatic gestures, but with small, steady steps, with trust built one fragile moment at a time. As the evening grew darker and the stars began to scatter across the sky, I felt a shift deep inside me, subtle but undeniable. I wasn't just longing anymore, I was beginning to believe. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt the stirrings of hope, not just for him, not just for us, but for myself, for the possibility that I could stop hiding, stop running, and finally let someone see me fully. It scared me to my core, but as he walked beside me, his hand brushing mine again and again, it also made me feel more alive than I had in years. The night stretched long, the kind of night where the air feels thick with something unspoken, and the world around us seemed to fall away until there was only the quiet rhythm of our steps and the sound of our breathing. The fence stood tall behind us, no longer a barrier but a witness to everything that had passed between us, and as we walked the length of it, I felt the pull inside me grow stronger, harder to resist. Each time his hand brushed mine it lingered just a little longer, until finally he stopped pretending it was accidental and slipped his fingers fully into mine. The gesture was simple, so small it could have gone unnoticed, but to me it felt monumental, a breaking point where hesitation gave way to something undeniable. My chest tightened, and I gripped his hand back, not lightly, not timidly, but with a firm hold that said I didn't want to let go. We paused under the shadow of an old tree, the branches reaching over the fence like open arms, and for a moment the world fell silent. The crickets, the distant hum of cars, the faint breeze rustling through the leaves, everything faded into a soft blur. He turned to me, his eyes catching the faint glow of the moonlight, and I saw in them a question he hadn't dared to ask before. My heart thundered in response, my throat dry, but I didn't step back. I stood there, every nerve alive, waiting. He lifted his free hand and let it rest gently against my cheek, and the warmth of his palm sent a shiver rushing through me. My eyes closed instinctively, and for a moment I simply leaned into the touch, letting myself feel it without fear, without shame, without the heavy walls I had carried for so long. When his lips finally met mine, it wasn't sudden or rushed. It was soft, careful, almost hesitant, as if he was giving me one last chance to pull away. But I didn't. I leaned into it, let it happen, let the years of silence and longing and loneliness pour out in the press of that kiss. It wasn't perfect, my breath was shaky, my movements uncertain, but it was real, and in its imperfection, it felt more honest than anything I had ever known. The kiss deepened slowly, naturally, until I could no longer tell where my fear ended and my desire began. I felt his fingers tighten around mine, his other hand steady against my face, and I knew with a clarity that shook me that I wasn't dreaming. This was happening. This was us. When we finally pulled apart, the space between us felt fragile, charged, as if the air itself had been changed. I kept my eyes closed for a moment, afraid that if I looked, it would all vanish, that he would be gone and I would wake to find myself alone again. But when I opened them, he was still there, watching me with a softness that made my chest ache. He didn't speak right away, and neither did I. There was no need. Everything had already been said in that kiss, in the way we had both chosen not to step back. But then he smiled, small and quiet, and the sight of it broke something open inside me. I smiled back, and for the first time in so long, it didn't feel forced. It felt natural, like the most honest thing I could give him. We sat down beneath the tree, side by side, our shoulders pressed together. His hand never left mine, his thumb brushing slowly across my knuckles in a rhythm that soothed the chaos still swirling inside me. I told him, in halting words, about the years I had spent hiding, about the fear that had kept me caged, about the nights I had convinced myself that this kind of connection wasn't meant for me. My voice shook, and sometimes the words wouldn't come, but he listened with a patience that never wavered. When I faltered, he squeezed my hand, grounding me, reminding me that I wasn't alone anymore. And when I finally fell silent, he told me softly that I didn't have to hide anymore, not with him. His words were simple, but they wrapped around me like a promise, steady and unbreakable. The hours slipped by unnoticed. The moon climbed higher, the stars shone brighter, and still we sat there, sharing stories, laughter, and silences that no longer felt heavy. Each moment wove itself into something larger, something stronger, a tapestry of connection that I had once thought impossible. I could feel the fear still lingering in the edges of my mind, whispering warnings, but it was quieter now, drowned out by the warmth of his hand in mine, by the memory of his lips on mine, by the certainty in his eyes. For the first time, hope didn't feel dangerous, it felt possible. When it was time to part, he didn't let go right away. He stood with me, his hand still holding mine, and told me that this didn't have to be the end, that we could see where it led if I was willing to try. His words struck something deep inside me, and though fear still clung to me, I nodded. I wanted to try. I wanted to see. As he walked away down the quiet street, he turned back once, his smile catching the faint glow of the streetlight, and I felt something inside me stir with a strength I hadn't known I carried. I touched my lips, still warm from his kiss, and let the feeling sink in, let it take root where the loneliness had once lived. The fence no longer felt like a boundary. It felt like a beginning. It was where he had come into my life, where the walls I had built had started to fall, where I had felt the first touch of something real. And as I stood there beneath the stars, I knew that whatever came next, I wouldn't face it alone. For the first time in years, I felt alive, not just surviving but living, not just existing but reaching for something bigger than my fear, bigger than the silence, bigger than me. And I knew that this was only the start of a story I had once believed I would never be brave enough to live.